Thanks, Emika. Well, it's very nice to meet you all. I'm going to be talking almost entirely about Britain, and of course in English, because I'm afraid I don't speak Japanese. So I hope it won't be too difficult. I will try to speak quite slowly. Oh yes, sorry. I use it works. Yeah, I suppose that's better. Yeah. I'll try to speak quite slowly. And also, I will talk for not more than 60 minutes. Then we can have time for discussion for half an hour before the break. But if at any point you don't understand something or want more information, then put your hands up. You have a list of reading. You don't have to feel you have to read all of that. It's a series of suggestions of further things to read if you want to find out more. In particular, some of the books deal with other European countries, because I think the comparisons are interesting. But I don't have time to talk about the complexities of all of Europe. But I put the books there because you might find them interesting and useful. Also, I have no idea whether they're available in your library because I constructed this back home in London. I might go and have a look now that I've arrived. How many of you have been to Britain? Good, actually most of you. Good, so maybe it won't sound too unfamiliar. Right, well, in the first session today, I'm going to talk about gender relations in Britain in roughly the first half of the 20th century, up to the end of the Second World War. Though I'm actually going to start in the 19th century, because to understand the situation at the beginning of the 20th century, then you need to know what has changed and what had not changed during the 19th century. So during the 19th century, the gender situation was very unequal. There were improvements from the 1850s onwards, mainly because of the growth of a feminist movement. Industrialization began in Britain at the end of the 18th century. It's sometimes thought that women had more equality and autonomy in pre-industrial agricultural society before workplace and home were separated in industrialization. But in reality, it seems there was very little difference. The situation for men and women was very unequal, both before and after industrialization, though sometimes in different ways. Women had very few rights, for example, in pre-industrial society. In industrial Britain, many working-class women continued to work, even after marriage and having children, because their families needed the money. They especially worked in the new textile industries that developed very quickly in the north of England. and also often worked in domestic service, working as servants for richer people and living in their homes. Married middle and upper class women were not allowed to work for pay outside the home. Very few did so later in the 19th century, but they were very few. And until the later 19th century, it was unusual and difficult for unmarried middle and upper class women to work. An alternative for these women was often voluntary action, charitable work, helping the poor, because many of them didn't want just to sit around at home, especially when they had servants to look after the children and do the housework. And there was a great need for charitable work, as I'll say later, because of the extent of poverty, and the state made very little provision for poor people. So voluntary action was a very important part of what middle and upper class women did. I'll talk more about that in a later lecture. In the 1850s still, married women could own no property. All her property when she married belonged to her husband, included, as it happens, any debts she might incur. So when a marriage was unhappy and a wife wanted to get her revenge on her husband, she could run up large debts, and he would have to be responsible. And indeed, some women did this. It was quite a good means of revenge. But it was also one reason why the law changed in 1870. Obviously, husbands were not too keen on this happening. But a more important reason for the change was campaigning by women. Women are more organised, they're demanding change more from the 1850s onwards, and more equal property rights. There were still not complete property rights yet, but they demanded change. Also, men and women had very equal opportunities to divorce if a marriage was unhappy, and not all marriages were happy. There was no divorce in England before 1857. There was divorce in Scotland. One complication that I'm not going to talk about, but it matters, is that Scotland had a different, still has, a different legal system from England, left from the days when it was an independent country, before the early 18th century. Also, there are important cultural differences between Scotland. Ireland has yet another legal system. Britain is a very complicated country. But in England, there was no divorce before 1857. In Scotland, there was divorce from the mid-16th century, and men and women had equal divorce rights. In England and Wales, because Wales always, because it had been tied to England since medieval times, had the same legal system. In England and Wales, after 1857, divorce was possible, but it was easier for a man to get a divorce than a woman. He could divorce his wife just if she was unfaithful to him, if she had a sexual relationship with someone else. A woman could not divorce her husband just for being unfaithful. There's a sexual double standard. It's accepted for men to be unfaithful, but not for women. To divorce a man, the wife had to prove he had done something else that was bad, being very violent, or committed homosexual acts which were strictly against the law, or had sex with animals even, but he had to have done something else in addition to adultery. And this remained the case. It was also very difficult and expensive to get a divorce. The other reason why women were often found it difficult to break up a marriage, even if it was unhappy, was that they did not have a right to custody of their children above the age of 7. Before the 1830s, they had no custody rights. If a marriage ended, then the husband had complete control of the children. It was only a campaign by a woman called Caroline Norton, who was upper class and well-connected. She had a very unhappy marriage. She was a victim of domestic violence. She left her husband eventually, and he took the children away. One of the children died, and she didn't know. And she then campaigned for a change in the law. But women were only allowed the care of their children up to the age of 7. After that, they were the responsibility of the husband again. The domestic violence that Caroline Norton suffered was not unusual. It seems we don't have clear numbers, but there was a campaign again by feminists in the 1870s and 80s against what they saw as a very prevalent problem of violence against women in marriage. This led to no change in the law. Violence against animals became illegal in 1835. Violence towards children by their parents in 1889. But violence against wives within marriage didn't become illegal until 1978, which was a rather a long gap. It was seen generally as a domestic issue, and again, the right of a husband to treat his wife as he liked. If a wife was violent to her husband, she received a much more severe penalty than a man would for injuring his wife. So again, there's a real difference in expectations of the sexes. Women in the 19th century, of course, didn't have the vote yet. After 1869, some women could vote in local government. This followed a campaign led by, among others, the philosopher John Stuart Mill, who was a very passionate feminist. He campaigned for equal voting rights for men and women. And this failed. But as a concession, Parliament gave the local government vote to women, but only if they were independent property holders. So this excluded married women, and it was mainly only richer widows or unmarried women who would hold property, and so had the vote. About 1 million women had the local government vote by the end of the 19th century. And increasingly also, they could be elected to office in local government. So they could be elected to boards of education, which were responsible for developing a state education system at the end of the 19th century, and could be elected as poor law guardians, supervising the welfare system. But it was the activity of women in local politics and their success that led some of them more and more to want the vote at national level. There were some people, including quite a number of women, who thought that it was right that women should only vote in local government, because local government looked after social questions, welfare, health, education. And these were seen as the particular responsibility of women. Women were good at caring for people, so they should be responsible. It was right they should be involved in administering welfare and education. But the difficult things that Parliament did, like thinking about the economy or about war, was men's job. Women shouldn't do things like this. But there was quite a debate about this at the end of the 19th century. But the campaign for the national vote became more and more active in the early years of the 20th century. And I'll come back to that. There are also gradually improved education opportunities for women with the growth of secondary education and higher education, mainly for better off women whose parents could afford it. But as state education expanded and became compulsory for all children from 1880, all children up to the age of 12, then girls were educated just as boys were. There was no question that girls had to go to school. Though there were some differences in the curriculum. Girls learned housecraft and boys learned woodwork and sports. And still, the number of women having higher education was extremely small by the beginning of the 20th century. The middle-class parents were often quite keen for their daughters to be educated, because although it was generally believed that the real duty of women was to marry and have children, parents recognized that it would not be possible for all women, because women were a majority of the population. There were more women than men in all age groups, and so some would not be able to marry. And if their family was not very wealthy, they would have to earn their living, so they needed an education. The reason why there were more women in the population was the higher death rates of males at every age from birth. There were very high infant death rates at this time, and boy babies were more likely to die than girl babies. And also males had shorter life expectancy at all ages. Also in the 19th century, there was a great deal of emigration from Britain, particularly to new colonies like Australia, Canada, and more men emigrated than women. So this, again, increased the imbalance. Some women were encouraged to emigrate because there was a majority of men in Australia and Canada, and so lots of opportunities to marry. And also often opportunities to be independent and set up in business, which they could not do in Britain. And there were charitable organisations whose purpose was to help women, surplus women as they were called, because they couldn't marry, help them to emigrate to one of the colonies. But the women who stayed behind, educated women, the main occupation open to them was teaching. Teaching either in the homes, children in the homes of richer families, or increasingly in schools towards the end of the century as the number of schools grew. School teaching was a respectable occupation for an educated woman. But also there are more jobs opening up with the growth of government. Government becomes more active, so it employs more people. And so there's a need for more workers in the civil service. And women are recruited mainly at lower levels as clerks or secretaries. And as new technology develops in the workplace at the end of the century, like typewriters and telephones, then it became work for women to use these machines. They were thought to be particularly, they had nimble fingers, it was thought, and so could use a typewriter keyboard more easily than men. Why they could use a telephone more easily than men, I have no idea, but these became women's jobs. And again, they're respectable jobs. But they would have, when they married, they would have to give up all of these jobs. So this applies mainly to middle and upper class women. Among lower class women, there's a very great deal of poverty throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. More poverty among women than among men, which continues to be true. This was partly for the reason, let's move on. Yeah. This was partly for the reason I gave earlier, that women outlived men. This meant that many women were left as widows, often with young children to support. They might remarry, but widows were less likely to marry again than widowers, men who were left with children. So this meant that at the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of lone parents, lone mothers, bringing up children. In fact, the numbers of single mothers at the end of the 19th century was as great as the number at the end of the 20th century. But the reasons were very different. In the 19th century, they were widows with children. At the end of the 20th century, they were divorced or separated or had never married. But the numbers are very similar. And the likelihood of poverty when they were on their own with children was very great. The other reason why women were poor was that they were more likely to live to be old than men. And the big reason was that throughout their lives, women couldn't earn enough to support themselves, their families, and save for old age, because women had more limited work opportunities than men and earned less. So poverty was a major problem for many women, and there were very high levels of poverty in the late 19th century. Obviously important in women's lives were the facts of marriage, childbirth, of demography. Most women did marry, though there was always a certain proportion who did not, around 10 up to 15% who just did not marry. Those who did marry had large families. There were also high levels of infertility. So family size was fairly evenly spread over every number from 0 to 10. Some had very many children, others had none. Or they might have no surviving children because of high infant death rates. Or so many women would be repeatedly pregnant until menopause, suffering also miscarriages and death of children. So women might become pregnant many times, but still have quite small, completed families. The birth rate began to fall from the 1870s. I meant, sorry, that's a mistake, 1870s. Sorry, I always write numbers down wrongly. It's a very bad habit. And that's very confusing. It did actually fall from the 1970s as well, but that's a different story. That 1870s. The reasons for that aren't very clear. One is that more women were better educated, wanted more independence. But I've also, and probably more important, was families at all social levels wanting better living standards and realizing that if they have fewer children, then everyone can have a better life. From early in the 20th century, women were campaigning to reduce the infant mortality rate and set up on a voluntary basis clinics and welfare centres where mothers and children could be given advice. Mothers advised on how to look after themselves in pregnancy to help to protect the child and how to raise the child. So the situation around 1900 was that gender relations were very unequal in all kinds of ways, but women were increasingly active in campaigning for greater equality. Between 1906 and 1914, there was a very active campaign for the vote, as there was in other countries at this time. The first country in the world to give women the vote was New Zealand in 1893. New Zealand was another immigrant country, a British colony, with a majority of men, and also a Labour government at the end of the 19th century. So it was socially quite progressive, but also there was no danger of women being a majority of voters. A number of the states that then made up Australia also gave women the vote shortly afterwards, at the end of the 19th century. The first country in Europe was Finland, where women got the vote in 1906. In Britain, there were increasingly active and militant demonstrations by the suffragettes, as they were called. Many of them were put in prison and quite badly treated. There was a scandal about it. But still the government refused to give them the vote. Then in 1914 came the First World War. The militant campaigners for the vote stopped and became supporters of the war. But quieter campaigning alongside the militant campaign had always been also a quieter lobbying campaign. The two complemented one another, and that continued during the war. During the war, women were important to the economy. They replaced men in many factories as the men went off to fight in the war. But women were admitted to the armed services for the first time. They're not to fight, but again, to drive vehicles, to do clerical work, to do work that liberated men to fight. Women were also important as nurses, nursing the sick during the war. And also, the numbers of women allowed to train as doctors increased during the war, because again, many of the doctors went off to support the servicemen. There was a shortage at home. And the medical schools, which had been very reluctant to train women. Women had been trying to train as doctors since the late 19th century. Many of them had had to go abroad, particularly to Switzerland, to train. But more of them were, many more were allowed to be trained during the First World War, but it stopped when the war was over, apart from one or two specialist medical schools for women. Then in 1918, women got the vote. At the same time, the franchise, the vote was extended for men. Up to that point, 40% of men also did not have the vote. On the whole, they were poorer men, but also included many middle-class men who were not property holders. So particularly younger middle and upper-class men who were not yet married and might live in their parents' homes or a rented home did not qualify for the vote. But in 1918, all men got the vote at age 21, which was a reward for their service in the war, but the Labour movement particularly had been campaigning for it. And women got the vote, but at age 30, not at age 21, so it still was not equal. The reason for this was because politicians were worried about women becoming a majority of the voters, because they were a majority of the population. And that was rather scary for the politicians. Also, the established politicians were concerned about giving the vote to so many working class men. This was because a working class movement, trade unions, and a working class political party, the Labour Party, had been growing before 1914 and grew further during the war. And it was thought that many of these men would vote for Labour and not for the established Conservative and Liberal parties. And the politicians seemed to believe that women above the age of 30 would be more sensible than younger women, and so would not vote for a radical party. So this seems to have been part of the calculation But the fact that women were a majority of the population was important. Though women were allowed to stand for Parliament at age 21, but not many of them did, mainly because there was a great deal of prejudice against women who wanted to be candidates. Many women wanted to, but could not get selected. And as you can see, not many were elected before the Second World War, or indeed for quite a long time afterwards. There was just one woman elected in 1918, but she was an Irish nationalist, and this was a time when Ireland was demanding independence, so she refused to take her seat in Parliament. And then very small numbers were elected in the 1920s and 30s. But this didn't mean that women were inactive in politics. Because it was hard for them to become members of Parliament, women rather organised in associations, campaigning for changes in the law, some of them drafting new legislation, and working with members of Parliament, often men, almost always men, who supported them in implementing legislation that they supported. And because politicians were concerned about women's votes, they wanted women's votes, they accepted many of these proposals for legislation. So many of the women who had campaigned to get the vote then became active in helping women to use the vote, training them in public speaking, in understanding the law, understanding how Parliament worked, helping women to become politically active. And many women joined the main political parties. So women were active in politics, more active in the 1920s and 30s than before. The book that's going around on women and citizenship has a number of essays about this. And they did achieve many more changes in the law than they had done before getting the vote. One of these was the Sex Discrimination Removal Act of 1919, which enabled women, for example, to become lawyers for the first time, and also to sit on juries in legal trials. These were important changes, though still fairly few women were able to take them up. But the reason for the change was that throughout history until then, if a woman was accused of a crime and had to go to a law court, she would be the only woman in a totally male environment. All the lawyers, the judges, the police, everyone was male, and she was on her own, which must have been a very different experience from a man going to court. And women had campaigned about this for some time, and in fact some women's organisations before 1914 had won the right to have a woman sit in court with the woman on trial, so she had some support. Similarly, women after 1918 campaigned successfully to have women appointed to the police. This was mainly so that if women suffered from sexual, and children suffered from sexual assault or physical assault, they could go to talk to a woman rather than only men who were, I mean, not all women were sympathetic and not all men were unsympathetic, but they reckoned it would make it easier for women if they could talk to a policewoman. And again, the numbers were few. Even now, women are a distinct minority of police officers, but the numbers did increase. And also in the 1920s, the women's campaigns achieved a better deal for illegitimate children. The amount of money that the father of an illegitimate child was required to pay for the child's support was increased. Making him pay it didn't get easier. In 1918, there was the Maternity and Child Welfare Act, which provided welfare clinics for mothers and children in most local authority areas. In 1923, women at last won equal rights with men to get a divorce, though it remained a very expensive operation, and divorced women suffered a lot of stigma. They also, in 1925, gained equal custody rights over children, which, as I said before, was very important, particularly enabling women to leave an unhappy marriage. The marriages did break up, despite the absence of divorce and all these difficulties. And one outcome was numbers of people living, cohabiting with, say, a woman left her marriage, she then could live with another man, but had to do so secretly. Because it was so difficult to get a divorce and to remarry. The women campaigned for new welfare measures, such as the first state pensions for widows in 1925. And this was recognition of the poverty of many single parents, widows with young children to support. And then in 1929, the age at which people could get married was raised to 16. Before that, a female could marry at 12 and a male at 14 if they had the parents' consent. And a number of very young girls were married before the law changed. And there were other changes, but these are some of the most important ones. Women in Britain were also involved in international campaigns. The formation of the League of Nations after the First World War, the precursor to the United Nations, which was an attempt to bring the nations of the world together to avoid another war. It wasn't, of course, successful, but it did provide a forum where, among other things, women's organizations from around the world got together and campaigned, for example, for maternity pay and maternity leave to allow women to have time off after they had a baby, instead of feeling they had to go straight back to work to earn a living, which was bad for the mother's health and bad for the baby. The outcome was the Washington Convention of 1919, that working mothers should be guaranteed 6 weeks paid leave before and after childbirth and free medical care. But like many resolutions of the League of Nations and the United Nations now, not every country obeyed it. But gradually it did mean that some countries introduced maternity leave. And the League of Nations became a focus for women's campaigning groups, as well as many men's campaigning groups. And the League did a lot to support women, and also generally to try to improve working conditions internationally. Another achievement of the campaigners was in 1928, at last women got the vote at age 21 on the same terms as men. But not all the campaigns were successful. For example, one thing that women were very actively demanding in the 1920s and 30s was equal pay. And equal pay for work of equal value, because pay was very unequal and the labour force very gender divided. Men and women did different work. Although job opportunities for women were growing during the war, there were more jobs for unmarried middle-class women. Again, with the growing size of business, the growing role of the state, and the growth of state welfare, for example, the expansion of healthcare, education, social services, which is happening in the 1920s and 30s, created jobs. In general, they're still subordinate jobs. There are still very few women doctors, lawyers, and still fewer businesswomen. And women who became lawyers and doctors faced a lot of prejudice. And women had to give up work when they married, still. This again women campaigned against, but unsuccessfully. Partly because in the 1920s and 30s there was very heavy unemployment. There was an international economic depression. Unemployment was particularly severe in Britain and went on for a long time through the 1920s and 30s. And it was thought right that married women should not work in order to create jobs for men. Though since men and women did different kinds of work, it wasn't actually likely to work that way. Working class women mainly had to give up factory work at the end of the war, whereas middle class women were able to keep on many of the jobs they had during the war. And more working class women had to go into domestic service, which they had left in large numbers during the war when there were other jobs available. But then in the 1930s, the economy begins to expand in new ways. There's the development of new industries, manufacture of motor vehicles and electrical goods. And these created work for women. Not the heavy work in the motor industry, but things like making covers for motor car seats and the essential work that's part of constructing a motor vehicle. And making light electrical goods. So this creates new kinds of factory work for women, very often making domestic appliances that replace domestic servants in the home. education is again expanding both for men and women, but still is quite unequal in all classes. Females stay at school for a shorter time than males. They're much less likely to go to university, though some did. It's a time when suddenly young unmarried women have much more freedom than they'd had before. Whereas at the beginning of the 20th century, and in the 19th century, it was very difficult for, in fact almost impossible, for a middle or upper class woman to go around on her own, and certainly not to be in the company of a man on her own if he was not a member of her family. They had to be escorted and looked after. They lead very sheltered lives. By the 1920s and 30s, women in all classes have more freedoms. Clothes are freer, shorter skirts, shorter hair. They don't have to wear hats all the time. They could travel around on their own and meet men who are not members of their family. It's easier for working class women than middle and upper class women. But middle class working women have much more freedom. Working class women in particular can enjoy more new forms of leisure, going to the cinema, going to dance halls, where naturally they meet men. But once they were married, women again had much more restricted lives, much more tied to the home, and particularly with the growth of towns, and particularly of suburbs at this time. The towns are growing, new areas are being built, new housing, the gardens, which are more attractive housing than in the town, but can leave women very isolated during the day. And these are mainly women who were more prosperous, but there was still a great deal of poverty by the 1930s, particularly in areas of high unemployment. And again, particularly concentrated among women. There's less poverty than at the beginning of the century, but still a lot. There are important demographic changes again. The fall in the birth rate that I mentioned at the end of the 19th century continued and reached its lowest point in the early 1930s. This happened all over Europe. It's why Hitler and Mussolini tried to bribe women to have more children, because their birth rates had gone down and they were concerned about it. But it's equally true in Britain and France. At the same time, the infant mortality rate, the death rate among young children, went down. All the efforts that were made to improve welfare and health care were successful, combined with improved food and better living standards. So many fewer babies die. But there was great concern about the falling birth rate, which I'll talk about in another lecture. A panic that the population was aging because people were living longer. So the kinds of things people say today, they were saying then. The reasons for this very sharp decline in the birth rate, I think again are associated partly with women having more education and independence. It seems to happen internationally, that when women get more education, and they're less willing to have a lot of children. But what I think is also important at this time in Britain and other European countries is that parents, including working class parents, realise their children can have a much better life if they have fewer children. They can afford to keep them at school and they can get a good job. And I think this is possible at this time in a way it had not been in previous history. The opportunities, say, in the mid-19th century for a poor child to get an education and then a good job were almost non-existent. By the 1930s, it's realistic that if you have just 2 children, let them have a good education, then there's a chance they will get a better job than their father or their mother. And that was beginning to happen. There's real social mobility. And there were surveys at the time asking people why they had fewer children. And many of them said, it's to give our children a better chance. We remember growing up, big, very poor, unhappy families, and we don't want that to happen to our children. And of course, when women have fewer children, then they can begin to think about their lives in different ways. Their lives are not completely dominated by pregnancy and child rearing. They can start to think about doing other things with their lives. But then along came another war in 1939, and the pattern of the previous war was repeated. Again, women were very important in the workforce. Women had to be independent because the men were away. Many of them were working in factories. There were a number of strikes by women for equal pay, because for the first time, many of them were doing the same work as men and resented being paid less. And this led the government during the war to set up a royal commission, an official investigation into pay, to find out how unequal it was and should anything be done about it. It didn't report until after the war. Talk about it later. Women also went into the armed services, again in large numbers, but in supporting roles. Women didn't become active in combat in the Army, Air Force and Navy until the late 1970s and 1980s. One thing that changed during the war was the end, because women were needed in the economy, the so-called marriage bar, the fact that women had to give up work when they married, came to an end. Married women were needed in the workforce, and it never came back. So after the war, this enabled more married women to work. It was widely believed that there was a great deal of promiscuity during the war, particularly in the armed services, with young men and young women thrown together. And the illegitimate birth rate did go up during the war. But also, it was discovered that there were many fewer babies born in the first 9 months of marriage. So what was really happening is, whereas it had been quite normal for a long time for people to marry because the woman was pregnant, in wartime they couldn't marry often because the father was at war, might even be killed, and this increased the number of illegitimate pregnancies, illegitimate births during the war. The official statistics showed that the number of births early in marriage went down by around the amount that the illegitimate birth rate went up. It was the first time it could be measured. So the Second World War brought some changes in women's access, particularly to work. And I'll talk in the next lecture about how long-lasting it was. So a great deal had actually changed in gender relations in Britain in the first half of the 20th century. There were distinct moves towards rather greater equality. Women had more freedoms, but of course great inequalities remained. So I'll stop now. We've got about 20 minutes for any questions you may have. Or anything that wasn't clear. Sit down. I hope it was reasonably easy to follow.
Thank you very much for your interesting lecture. My name is Moriko. I'm studying in the grad school of Kyoto University, Sociology department. I'm interested in the second page, feminism, about campaign, women's campaign section. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just heard British women's campaign started from quite educated women, such as Virginia Woolf, etc. And I wonder how it's getting involved with working class women as well. And I would be very pleased if you could explain it more.
Yeah. It did start with middle class women, and particularly in the mid-19th century, it's middle class women, as far as we can tell. But when women start actively campaigning for the vote, it's clear that quite a lot of working class women, particularly women who are employed in the textile districts of Lancashire and Yorkshire in the north. There's an interesting book by two women called Jill Liddington and Jill Norris, called One Hand Tied Behind Her, which is about the working class suffrage movement in the north of England. And Jill Liddington has done more recent work on Yorkshire particularly. And we have much more evidence about the campaign for the vote. But there were many women, working class women, who joined the Labour movement and the precursors to the Labour Party, like the Independent Labour Party that's formed in the 1890s. And they campaigned for the vote and equal rights for women. So when working class women were often active within political movements and trade unions. So there's definitely something was going on. And some were leading strikes. There were strikes by working class women. They were involved in, there were big strikes in textiles in the 1880s that women were involved in. And there's a famous strike of women who made matches for lighting fires in East London in the late 1880s.
Thank you very much.
Good, that helped.
Can I ask you a question? I want to know the nature of marriage bar. Was it a legal restriction?
Yeah. Yeah, in the government service it was. It was supposed to be removed in 1919 in the Sex Disqualification Removal Act, but it wasn't. So yes, I think in most private business it wasn't a legal enforcement, but the employer just wouldn't employ married women. So
when did it start, the legal restriction?
it's at the end of the 19th. It's almost as soon as women start to be promoted in the civil service. When they start to threaten men's promotion, they introduce a marriage bar which excludes many women. Obviously they couldn't stop unmarried women being promoted, and some were. But as more women come into the public service, it's implemented.
So was the situation very similar to Germany? I heard married women in Germany couldn't work. There was legal restriction. Is it the
Yes,
same?
but it carried on much longer in Germany. Yeah, because after the Second World War, then it disappears in Britain, except in banking, where it went on to the 1960s, but everywhere else it disappeared.
So how about private sectors in Germany? So you said it was not legal prohibition in Britain, but how about Germany?
I don't know actually what the legal situation was. No, I must ask somebody. I just don't know.
Thank you. I have more questions, if I may. In the second page, I'm curious about the age. Women gained vote at age 30, but women could stand for parliament at age 21.
Yes, well, nobody could understand this until one of my PhD students recently, for the first time, researched it.
Oh.
And the situation was, as I said before, there were quite a lot of middle-class men who didn't have the vote before 1918 until they were older, because they weren't married. And when this was brought up in Parliament, when allowing women to stand at age 21, when it came up in Parliament in 1918, a number of men stood up and said, well, I stood for Parliament when I didn't have the vote. And some of them were government ministers. They were older now and they had a vote, but when they first stood for Parliament, they didn't have the vote. So there was no logical or legal reason to treat women differently. So Parliament had to accept it. Which is very, nobody knew this until my half Japanese student, as it happens, found this out. In fact, very few very young women did stand for Parliament. I think one was elected before 1928.
You said the Irish women refused?
She refused to sit in Parliament. All the Irish, it was part of the Irish campaign for independence.
Yeah.
They would vote for for members of the Nationalist Party in elections, but then they would not sit in Parliament. By this time, They were boycotting Parliament.
But she decided to stand up.
Yes, to make the point, there was a lot of support for nationalism.
Oh.
It was to prove that the Irish supported independence. So she'd made her point. She didn't want to sit in Parliament.
Complicated.
Yes, it is. Well, British politics are very common. They're complicated because of Ireland and Scotland and Wales. They've recently become even more complicated again.
And I want to add one thing, just to explain to Japanese students the concept of family size. Family size is the number of children
Yes.
of the family. So, but in Japan, probably you think family size
You'd include relatives
and grandparents
Ah.
even. So household size and family
Yeah.
size is different concept.
Yeah. Yes.
So
Sorry,
she-
that means just number of children. Yeah.
She talked about the number of children.
Yes, I must remember that.
So large families mean the families with many children.
Yeah.
In this context.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, thank you. I'll remember that in future.
So household size means the number of family members.
Yes. That would include, if, say, there are grandparents living in the house, or other family members, that would be household size.
And even including the servants
Yeah.
who
of
are not
course.
relatives.
Yeah. Yeah, by this time. In earlier history, they often would be relatives, but now they wouldn't be in the 19th, 20th century.
I have more questions. If there's nobody. So can I ask you another question about the age at marriage? You said many women married at younger age before the legal change in 1920s or 30s.
Not many, some did.
Oh, some.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking about the European marriage pattern. Marriage age in Europe was higher, even in pre-industrial period.
Yeah.
Yeah, pre-industrial period it was higher,
Yeah,
even higher.
around 25 on average. Yeah, no, I mean, not many, but some
Oh,
very young girls were married, and so it was to prevent sexual exploitation, obviously. They wanted to raise it.
So what is the case of parents who decided to marry them to?
They had to have their parents' permission. It quite often happened because the young girl got pregnant, and so they wanted her to be respectably married.
So it was not like selling daughters to men.
No, as I'll say in my next lecture, that's now become an issue with the Muslim population, forced marriage. And I wouldn't care to say it never happened in Britain, but it wasn't part of the culture. It was more likely to happen among the upper classes to force a daughter to marry a suitably rich partner than to happen in the lower classes.
women success in raising the payment by doing strike. I want to know if there were major oppression against them, saying this is a wartime national crisis. You shouldn't be complaining about your
pay. That's interesting. That there seems not to have been. I think because they were so essential to the war, then the employers and the government gave in very quickly. The same thing happened in the First World War, not with women so much, but men striking. Because they took advantage of the fact that they were so important to the economy. So rather surprising, you would expect that kind of reaction. But I haven't, and there must have been some of it, but I haven't heard it being a big issue. And of course the government did respond by looking into the question of equal pay, but that was to try and keep them quiet and stop more strikes.
Because I thought maybe in Japan during the war you would be forced for working for nothing. Maybe the foreign nation were motivated to work for the nation, for no pay.
Actually, the British government took a very different approach. It really wanted to keep the population happy, so that they supported the war. And I think they realised that if they refused the women equal pay, they would become resentful and perhaps oppose the war. Whereas if they get what they want, then they carry on supporting the war. So the government made very, again I'll talk about this when I talk about welfare, the government made big efforts to make conditions as good as possible, so that morale, as they put it, was kept high. And they had investigators who went around the country to find out what people were talking about and what they thought. And if they were getting unhappy, to try and do something about it. They were very interested in the psychology of the population and how to keep people cheerful. It's quite interesting. The different ways that different governments react to war really is quite interesting.
Something about the marriage bar that I would like to ask. You said that during the war, married women were allowed to work. But then after the war, it writes here there was an end of the marriage bar, but it didn't happen suddenly, right? So did they allow the married women to still stay in their work positions when the war ended? Or did they ask them to leave immediately?
It varied quite a lot. I'll talk about this a little bit later. I mean, some work was only there for the war. It was making armaments, for example. So, of course, that came to an end. But in other occupations, after the Second World War, women were much less likely to have to leave their jobs than after the First World War. That was because there was a shortage of labour. The economy was quite successful after the Second World War. And the government was worried about having too few workers. So it's encouraging older women to stay in the workforce. It wants young women to give up and get married and have babies because they want the birth rate. Birth rate was already rising again, and they want that to continue. But they actually encourage older women to stay at work. It's quite interesting.
So when was it legal that they stopped the marriage bar?
It's gradually removed in different occupations throughout the war. And I don't know if there's a particular point at which, There must have been a ruling in the public sector at the end of all the civil service teaching, everything else. And I'm not quite sure when that happened, actually. I must look it up. Of course, there were always women who cheated, who pretended not to be married. I once interviewed someone who'd been a school teacher at this time, and she said when the marriage bar was abolished in her school, amazingly, a lot of women seemed to have got married overnight. And particularly if you lived in a big city like London and lived some distance from the school, nobody would know that you were secretly married. But if you lived in a small town, you couldn't get away with it. And it was, I mean, even if a marriage broke up or a woman was widowed, it could be quite hard for her to get back to work. It depended very much on the senior people in the school or the department, whether they would take her back. And there were certain rules, like if she had a sick or disabled husband who couldn't work, they wouldn't allow her back to work, even though they needed an income, because it was her job to look after him. But if he was, say, seriously mentally ill and in a mental hospital, so she couldn't look after him, then she could go back to work. So there were all kinds of strange rules emerged.
If there's anybody who wants to raise question in Japanese,
Oh, that's true.
maybe Tani-san will help.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question? Sorry. Yeah. Today I'm your student, so please allow me about the about the League of Nations. I am aware now. European Union is playing an important role in promoting gender equality.
Yeah.
So did the League of Nations have same function?
I think it did, but it didn't have the same power that the European Union has. But it could certainly recommend things. The International Labour Office, for example, which was part of the League of Nations, was really very good in setting higher standards of work conditions and pay for men and women. But governments didn't have to take any notice, like about maternity leave. Whereas the European Union can put pressure on governments to implement, though the British government's always a bit resistant. It has had a lot of effect on not just gender equality, but other forms of equality. They issued a directive a few years ago against age discrimination, for example, and disability discrimination, which has been important.
But I'm curious, why always supranational organizations are more liberal?
Perhaps they can afford to be kind of free of the kind of I don't know. And they are the focus of international pressure groups. And organised women across Europe have put a lot of pressure on the European Union.
I know the current situation, but I'm intrigued. The League of Nations was the same.
Yeah, women from across the world got together at the League of Nations. But it did appoint women officials. They had certain posts that were reserved for women. So it encouraged women to take part in its activities.
I think the role of supranational organization is very important to think about the development of gender equality in European context.
Yeah, it is.
We do not have it in Asia. And I sometimes think of the situation we have some supranational organization within Asia. It might become patriarchal.
That's not what I was thinking, but I don't. Is it time to have a break? No?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, let's have a break for 15 minutes or so, and then continue.
Shall we go to the Department of Sociology?
Oh, this is time of this.
一緒に休みにとしたら。
はい。
I'll
be right.
For the next seminar.
Oh, no, sorry, that's, yeah. How do I can't?
Okay.
I can't read it 'cause it's in Japanese. So I
know,
don't know where
I know.
to.
I have this problem.
I have my office computer because I.
Do you mind to put your background?
Yes, right, of course.
For the filming?
Of course. Not everyone's back yet, so.
Would you mind to use the microphone?
Yeah. Should I start? Just one person is not back yet.
But it's time to start.
Okay.
So please go ahead.
Right, so I guess we better start again. And again, I'll talk for about 60 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So carry on from where I stopped before. As we said in the discussion, unlike at the end of World War I, when women were expected to leave their jobs, at the end of World War II, the government wanted them to stay at work And from 1943 onwards, the government was planning to keep particularly older women in work because they thought there was going to be a shortage of labour after the war, not enough workers to fill the employment. And the Labour government that was elected in 1945 was very keen to expand the economy after the Depression before the war. And in fact, the period after 1945 up to the early 1970s was a very unusual period in Britain of almost full employment. The first time in peacetime there had been full employment, and it continued for a long time. But as I said in the discussion, they were keen for older women to stay at work, but not younger women. They wanted them to marry, have children, because they were still very concerned about the low birth rate. The birth rate had started rising again during the war, but nobody seemed quite aware of that. And they weren't convinced that it would continue after the war. So they wanted to do all they could to keep the birth rate higher. So younger women were being encouraged to marry. As I also said, the marriage bar on married women came to an end. And an important change again after the Second World War was it became acceptable for the first time for middle-class women to work for pay. So the women who previously had been socially banned from working were able to work. Though another important change after the war was there were many fewer domestic servants because there was full employment. Working class women were able to get other and more independent jobs. So middle class women did not have servants to help them. And this is the period when we see the beginning of the so-called M-shaped work pattern for most women, of working between leaving education and having the first child, then taking time off to care for children, and then coming back into the workforce, sometimes to part-time work. But that becomes very common in all classes at this time. But again, when women were not working in the same jobs as men, and there's no obvious improvement in the kind of work available to them, and women returning to work after time off to rear children found it very difficult to get training to improve their position or to get a new kind of job. So again, they're very often doing rather lower level work. Though educated middle class women found that they were much in demand as school teachers when they came back as older women. This was partly because of the expansion of education after the war. There was demand. Also, as we'll see, there were much higher rates of marriage, so there were fewer young women in teaching, and also fewer older unmarried women who had been an important part of the teaching workforce. But there's an interesting contrast between middle-class women are allowed to work, as they had not been before, though sometimes their husbands would not allow it. It was not uncommon for women to say that my husband won't allow me to go to work. He feels it's his job to provide for the household. But more middle-class women were working. But more working-class women were able to afford not to work. They could actually give up work, at least for a while, because their husbands had full employment and better pay. So the household income was higher. So it wasn't so necessary for them to work. And for many working class women, that was a new liberation. It was new freedom. They no longer had to look after the house and the family and have a full-time job. They could take time off if they needed to, or work part-time. And this went along, particularly in the 1950s, as living standards rose, with improved housing and improved conditions at home. Gradually, particularly by the 1960s, more domestic appliances like washing machines and vacuum cleaners, which makes housework easier. And they're spreading to more working class as well as middle class people. So all of these things are actually making, with some particularly working class women's lives, easier. They benefit from houses that are easier to keep clean, more appliances. Whereas middle class women have the appliances, but they've lost the servants who used to do so much of the work. So they have they're actually having to do more housework, many of them. Also important after 1945, which is something I'll say more about in a later lecture, is the expansion of a welfare state under the Labour government that was the first majority Labour government to be elected in 1945. This introduced a national health service, for the first time providing free health care for everybody. And this was particularly beneficial for working class women and children who previously had not had access to free health care. Many working men had health care under the National Insurance Scheme, which had been introduced in 1911. And I'll talk about that in another lecture. But this didn't cover their families. And there were surveys in the 1930s showing just how bad the health conditions of many working class women were. And also there were quite high levels of malnutrition among children before the war. And things like the provision of free milk at school greatly helps that kind of problem. So there's much improved health care which benefits women, also improvements in education and in a wide range of welfare benefits, but I'll talk about those another time. But in general, welfare state was good for women because, as I said before, women were more likely to be poor than men, so they benefited particularly from improved welfare provision. But still, although the age of school leaving was raised to 15, and there are more places at university, but chances are still unequal because women are still expected to marry, and many families believe that it's a waste to educate a girl for too long because she'll only get married and not make use of her education. And females were still only 25% of all university students. And that's 25% of a very small number. Only 1.5% of 18 to 21-year-olds went to university between the late, well, it begins in the 1920s and continues to the 1960s. It's a very, I mean, now it's over 40%. It's a very small elite who go to university. The most common form of higher education for most women was teacher training, which was a specialized 2-year education, whereas the university education was 3 years, or 4 years in Scotland, because Scotland is different on almost everything. And teacher training happened then in separate institutions, not in universities. Now they've been merged with universities. So I'm forgetting to move the PowerPoint on. That's the stuff that I've seen. Anyway, it goes in front of you. There are very important demographic changes after the war. A much higher proportion of people marry, almost everybody married. In the 1930s, about 15% of women and 9% of men never married. After the war, almost everybody marries, at least once, and some more than once. And marriages lasted longer. Above all, death rates were lower because living standards and medical care improved. So there are fewer young widows with children. And divorce was still expensive and difficult. So marriages, whether they were happy or not, lasted much longer than before. It was still only possible to get a divorce if one partner or the other had been unfaithful, if they'd committed adultery. You couldn't get a divorce because you really didn't get on, or because one partner has left. That's not allowed till 1969. Even if one partner has gone, you have to prove that they've been unfaithful with somebody else, which led to people pretending to have affairs in order to get, in order to get a divorce. It was a very silly situation, but it is very difficult still. Though still people did separate and secretly live together. As more people get married and marriages last a long time, the birth rate went up. And continued to do so until the late 1960s. But the number of children in the family still remained quite low, an average of 2.5. The birth rate went up because more people had babies, because more people marry, and there's less infertility, which again must be related to better standards of health. Also, very importantly, the age of marriage went down. As Professor Okai said earlier, traditionally in Northwest Europe, the age of marriage had been quite high. The average for women for centuries was about 25. It goes down after the Second World War until the early 1970s to about age 22 or 23. So women are marrying younger. This is something that stops many of them getting well established in careers, particularly if they do go to university, because they don't have very long in work before they have their first child and give up work. But it did mean, of course, that if they have their first child very young and have only 2 or at most 3 children, usually quite close together, then there's a lot of their life left over when the children are older, which again helps to account for the M-shaped curve. Women want to go out to work, if only to meet other people, when their children are older. But it's difficult when children are young, even if they wanted to work, because there's very poor childcare provision. As I said, no servants. And quite a lot of hostility at this time, in the late 40s and 1950s, to working mothers, mothers of young children going to work. Despite the welfare state, there was still poverty, though not as great as before. And it's most concentrated amongst older people. And women are still a majority of older people, and they're poorer. And in large families, there were some larger families. And also among single mothers, those who had left their husbands or had illegitimate children, or the numbers are not very large, but they exist. But they did get more support from the state than they would have done before. Feminism was not very strong in this period after the war. The word feminism has always been problematic, with many women denying that they're feminists, even when they might believe in equal pay and equal rights. The word has always had a rather negative image in the minds of many people, not just since the 1960s, it's equally true in the 1920s and 30s, when something you could reasonably call feminism was quite strong, because lots of women are campaigning for gender equality, but the word is very unpopular. And it was certainly, if anything, even less popular after the Second World War. But there still were campaigning women's groups, many of them continuations of pre-war campaigns, many of them campaigning on the old issues like equal pay, improved legal rights. But there were new ones that started in the late 30s, like a campaign for an abortion law, because abortion was illegal in Britain. But many women secretly had illegal abortions, which could be very dangerous for them. Or if they were rich, they could buy them from doctors. So there are a number of issues, campaigns to improve higher education, particularly science education for women, because women were very marginalised in the sciences and in scientific occupations. And so there's a group of women campaigning to improve women's access to science. One success for campaigning women was family allowances, which were introduced in 1945. The government decided, this is something women had campaigned for throughout the 1920s and 30s, in order to improve the incomes of families with children. But they had always assumed that the pay should go to the mother, that in fact they thought of it as a mother's allowance, a kind of payment by the state as a reward for bringing up children. When it was introduced by the government in 1945, it's called a family allowance, but it's really aimed at children. And it's intended really to encourage families to have more children. So it wasn't paid for the first child, because it wasn't enough to have just one child. you got an allowance for your second and later children. But it wasn't very large, but for poorer people, it made a difference to their income. But the original intention of the government was to pay it to the husband through his wage packet. But the women campaign, led by a woman called Eleanor Rathbone, who had led a campaign in the 20s and 30s and was a member of Parliament by 1945. They campaigned to have it paid directly to the mothers because they didn't always trust the fathers to make sure the money was spent on the children. They might spend it on drinking or gambling and so that they were successful. It was paid to the mother. And its successor, child benefit, still is paid to the mother, except when there's a single father looking after children. But our present government is doing all kinds of strange things to child benefit and other welfare payments. But at the moment, that remains the case. There was also a very active equal pay campaign, continuing the campaign during the war. I mentioned earlier that the government set up a royal commission on equal pay to investigate the situation during the war. This reported in 1946, and it described how unequal pay was in most sectors of the economy, both in the public and the private sector. The majority of people on the commission held back from recommending that the government should legislate for equal pay because they said in the post-war situation it might harm the economy. But a minority of women on the commission recommended that there should be equal pay. But the Labour government refused to implement it because they said it would increase the costs of business at a time when they were trying to expand the economy. But women kept on campaigning. And in 1955, they succeeded in gaining equal pay in the public sector. This was from a Conservative government, because the Conservatives were concerned to keep the votes of working women. It was confined to the public sector because the government could control that. The government could insist. In the private sector, as I'll describe later, it's very much harder to make employers do anything, really. Certainly to do something like that. And also, it was much more obvious in the public sector that men and women were doing the same work. For example, as school teachers. Men and women school teachers do the same job, librarians, doctors. So it was whereas it's less obvious in the private sector when men and women are doing the same or different work. So at least there was an achievement in 1945. And into the 1960s, women continued to be active in trade unions, campaigning for equal pay and equal work opportunities. Then in the 1960s, particularly the later 1960s, many things changed. In particular, Britain was a richer country than it had been before the war. More people had higher living standards, they were better educated, they were more confident, especially the younger generation that had grown up since the war in good circumstances and with high expectations. There was another Labour government from 1964 to 1970. The Conservatives had been in government from 1951 to 1964. When Labour came back into government, it wanted to further expand the welfare system, which it did, particularly reforming secondary education in a way that provided more opportunities for girls. There were more places for girls at the better schools than there had been before. And also they continued an expansion of universities with the creation of new universities. This had been begun by the Conservatives, and they carried it on. So by the early 1970s, about 7% of all 18 to 21-year-olds were at university, and a rather higher proportion were women. But girls still tended to be concentrated in the arts and social sciences, particularly the arts, like literature and history. The sciences were overwhelmingly dominated by males, and engineering, and that continues to be true. Also, women still had very limited opportunities to train as doctors. The medical schools had quotas, that is, fixed numbers of women they would admit, which were quite small, and they quite discriminated against women. And until sex discrimination was outlawed in 1975, but it limited, only about 20% of medical students were female. But the Labour government improved pensions and healthcare again, and also child benefits, which was good for everybody and particularly good for women. And then from 1967 onwards, there's a quite remarkable run of liberalising legislation. First of all, abortion was legalised in 1967 for the first time. Also, homosexual acts in private were legalised, whereas again, homosexuality being against the law, or the practice of it. At least homosexuality amongst men. Lesbianism had never been against the law, because it was not supposed to exist, I think. Nobody took it seriously. They hadn't bothered to make it illegal. Then in 1969, at last, divorce became much easier. It was possible at last to divorce someone, or for a couple to divorce if they'd lived apart for 3 years. That was thought to be fairly decisive. So there didn't have to be any cruelty or adultery. They simply couldn't live together. At the same time, the government made the birth control pill available in local clinics. The pill had just been introduced in the 1960s. In the early 60s, it was quite expensive. It wasn't available on the health service. But from 1969, it became more freely available. Other things the government did at this time was abolish capital punishment and introduce a Race Relations Act, which made racial discrimination illegal. This was a time when there was increased immigration to Britain, particularly from the Caribbean and from India and Pakistan, former colonies. And these people had faced hostility and discrimination. And then in 1970, in a hurry, just before they lost the election, an Equal Pay Act was introduced. And this laid a duty on all businesses in the private sector to implement equal pay within 5 years. But again, it proved very hard to make employers do this. They invented all kinds of creative ways of evading the law. For example, there was one shoe shop where all the male sales assistants were regraded as managers, so they could continue to have a higher pay than the women, but they all continued to do the same work. And there are other examples like that. It's extremely hard to make people do things if they can find ways to evade it. And it's very hard to prove that they're doing something wrong. But at least the principle was introduced, and some people did obey it, and there was a slight movement towards more equal pay. And this liberalisation of the law in important ways was part of an international movement. There are similar changes certainly in much of Western Europe. Many of them a little bit later than in Britain. And the interesting question is why it happened at this time. It can't really be attributed to the women's movement, which got going at the end of the 1960s. The women's liberation movement, as it was called, began in Britain in 1969, which is after much of this legislation. Obviously, many women in that movement were campaigning on these issues. But I think it's an outcome much more of the broader social pressures. Not only the women who'd been campaigning for a long time for things like equal pay and abortion rights, but also many men who also felt that the way that some women died having illegal abortions and the unfairness of the divorce law and unequal pay needed to be changed. So I think pressure had been building up on most of these issues for quite a lot of time. And there were members of Parliament who worked quite hard to get this legislation passed. But it's still rather surprising. There are so many changes in such a short time. Anyway, as I said, the women's liberation movement got going after 1969, mainly a movement of younger women, part of the international movement of students and protesters of various kinds that are evident after 1968, after the events, the riots in Paris in 1968. And I think the effect of the women's liberation movement was to raise the consciousness, as they put it, of more people, both women and men, about important aspects of gender equality, inequality. Where I think they had a particular impact was in making public issues of sexual and physical violence against women, and domestic violence and rape particularly. And it's very noticeable from this time, these things are publicly discussed in a way they've not been before. As I said, there was a campaign about domestic violence in the late 19th century, then it goes underground again. It was raised by feminists in the 1920s. And as I said, one reason why they wanted women in the police was to help women victims of violence of this kind. But they don't talk about it explicitly. They use a kind of coded language. And reading what they say, it took me a while to realize what they were talking about, because it wasn't accepted to talk particularly about sexual matters in public. So you didn't talk about rape particularly, even though it happened. And what changes from the late 60s is people talk about these things, and they haven't stopped, partly of course because the problems haven't stopped. And the women's liberation movement made a particular issue of domestic violence and rape, saying these harm women and it's time something was done about it. And they did something about it, setting up refuges that women could go to. They could escape with their children from violent partners. And also counselling services to help women, and also men who've been raped, and people who are victims of violence in various ways. And then some of the more progressive local authorities funded these services, so they became gradually part of public provision in at least some places. And an outcome was, in 1976, the first law against the first law against domestic violence. I mean, previously, it had been very difficult for women who were victims of domestic violence to do anything about it. The police would not intervene. They regarded violence within marriage as a private matter, which was not the police's business. Now, they had a duty to intervene. And the men could be punished, or a woman if she was perpetrating violence. So, 140 years after cruelty to animals, cruelty to wives becomes against the law. And around the same time, Labour lost the election of 1970, and the Conservatives were in office till 1974. Then Labour came back and was responsible for the domestic violence legislation, but also important in 1975 for the first Sex Discrimination Act. And this prohibited discrimination against women or against men in everything, in work, in education, in the provision of services. The law was actually taken advantage of by a man who protested to the European Court that it was unfair that women should get their old age pension at age 60 and men not till 65. And of course he's right, there was a gender inequality there. It had been there since 1940. And as a result, the government had to equalise. They've done it very, very slowly, over about 20 years. So the women's pension age is gradually rising to 65. But it did have, for example, one effect of the Sex Discrimination Act was to force the medical schools to admit, to remove their restrictions on women. So many more women came, and now half of the people who go into medicine are female. And similarly in the law, although they didn't have formal quotas, in practice very few women qualified as lawyers. But they had to be very careful after 1975. And now again, half the people qualifying as lawyers are female. So it had an effect on the professions. In education, it meant that Oxford and Cambridge, which, unlike most universities, had different colleges for men and women, and fewer for women. Before 1975, there were 5 colleges for women in Oxford. And I forget how many for men, but there are 20-something. There are a lot. Cambridge had only 3 colleges for women and a lot for men. Gradually, some had begun to discuss going co-educational before this. But after 1975, gradually, reluctantly in some cases, they all had to. And so the proportion of women admitted to the 2 most elite universities rose very sharply. Other universities had admitted men and women in much more equal numbers, though there's still this big division in the subjects that they studied. And there are other changes. For example, up before 1975, a married woman could not sign a contract without her husband's permission. You know, even something quite trivial like renting a television set, she had to get her husband to sign. After that disappeared. And an Equal Opportunities Commission was established to ensure that the legislation was implemented to investigate complaints about gender inequality and support women in bringing cases under the law if they felt discriminated against. And as Professor Okai mentioned before, the European Union was very important in all of this. In fact, it was a big reason why the Sex Discrimination Act was passed. Britain joined the European Union in 1973. And gender equality had always been a big issue at the EU. So in order to conform with EU practice, the government had to do something about gender equality. But it also meant that the European courts of law were there as a source of appeal against the British courts if they did not resolve a case satisfactorily. So as I said before, the man who challenged the pension ages put it through the British courts and lost. He appealed to the European Court and won. And the Equal Opportunities Commission supported a number of women in bringing cases. If they failed in the British court, they would support them because it's expensive going to any court. They supported them in the European court. There was one case, for example, in a shipyard in the north, where the women cooks demanded equal pay with men who were manual workers somewhere in the yard. I forget what the comparison was, but they reckoned they should be getting the same pay as these men. They lost in the British courts, but won in the European court, and the employer had to implement equal pay. And there have been a number of cases like that. The Northern Ireland government was forced to allow gay rights, homosexual rights, after an appeal. I mean, after the London government did, as a result of a case brought in the European courts. So the European Union has been very important on gender issues and other kinds of equality issues, partly by issuing directives, as it calls them, telling people, governments, what they ought to do, but also because individuals can use the courts to challenge their own government. From the early 1970s, there's an increase in divorce following following the 1969 Act, with divorces mostly sought by women, which is interesting given that most women after divorce are worse off than the men. But still, it's the women who demand divorces, which is also true in other West European countries. I'm not entirely sure why it's true. I've never seen a good explanation, but it's quite clear that a majority of petitions for divorce come from women. And you can see how the numbers went up from 57,000 around the time of the legislation up to 165,000 by the early 1990s. So, as I said, most women were poorer after a marriage breakup, and generally they were supporting the children and still with more limited pay and work opportunities than men. Of course, many people remarry after divorce, but again, men were more likely to do so than women. Also, from the early 1970s, the birth rate began to fall, having remained fairly high until then. This coincides, of course, with the birth control pill becoming widely available. But it goes along with other cultural changes. There are many more couples living together openly without marriage. As I've said, this happened before, but it was always secret, and people would pretend to be married. Now they didn't pretend. Also, it becomes possible for an unmarried mother to live openly as an unmarried mother with her child, whereas it had always been a matter of shame. So there's a very quick cultural shift, which I still can't really explain. I've never seen a good explanation of why these changes happened. But by the end of the 1980s, 1/3 of all babies were being born to unmarried parents, which is a lot. And it's, again, a very striking change. In a situation, as I say, it's not a favourable situation for women to be bringing up children on their own. So fewer people get married. Those who do marry later, in their late 20s, early 30s or later. And so very often, cohabitation and having children happens before marriage. People are more likely to marry when they're quite certain that it's going to work, which is one reason why divorces have gone down since the early 1990s. Fewer people are married, so fewer can get divorced, but also they try out the marriage ahead of time. And as I say, these were major cultural changes, which there were conservative governments in office from 1979 to 1997, and they attacked all of these things: cohabitation, divorce, promoted marriage, but it seemed to have quite the opposite effect. Fewer and fewer people got married as the 1980s went on. The Prime Minister from 1979 was Britain's first female Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, which posed all kinds of conflicts for feminists about whether they should support her as a successful role model because she was the Prime Minister, or whether because she was very conservative and opposed to many of the things they wanted, they should hate her. I think on balance they ended up hating her, but it did pose a real problem. And it's certainly true that she was not at all favourable to feminism or to giving opportunities to women. There were not many women in her government. She believed that everybody had equal opportunities to do well and should succeed the way she had succeeded. On the other hand, she was a strong woman and she did provide a female role model for many people, so it's obviously a mixed story. And it was rather surprising for the Conservative Party to elect a woman. It happened pretty much by accident because the men were competing with one another and were quite evenly divided, and she rather unexpectedly popped up in the middle and won the election for the leadership. And I think it was quite a shock to the men. But then they quite liked being ordered about by a woman, many of them said. And we've not had another Prime Minister or even party leader who's a woman since then. So again, all these cultural changes, again, I think like the falling birth rates, more women living independently with children, is partly due to women asserting more independence, partly because there's been progress in education and improved work opportunities, still not equal, but a lot better by the 1980s than before. For example, they can become doctors or lawyers more easily. And it also becomes easier for women who come back into work after having children to get training. More of them go to university, more of them train as lawyers. I think that's really quite an important shift. There was a great increase in university places in the 1980s and 90s. So it's now 40% of 18 to 21-year-olds go to university, who have belatedly caught up with much of Western Europe and many other countries. And by the end of the century, more than 50% of students were female, though still tending to be concentrated in the arts and social sciences. There's still not many in chemistry, physics, engineering. But it was also obvious by the end of the century that women, that females, were performing better than males at all levels of education, up to university level. They did better in examinations. And this is true in all ethnic groups, in all racial groups in the country. But it didn't yet translate into equal opportunities in the workplace after education. There was, sorry, I'm forgetting again. So that's what I've already been saying. There was less progress in politics. Still, rather few women were elected. As a table that gives you comparisons with other countries. And you can see how low the proportion in Britain was in the 1950s still. And in fact, it's quite low in most countries. By the mid-90s, there's a great increase, particularly in the Scandinavian countries, and still more so by 2005, by which time Britain is beginning to catch up. But the real breakthrough in women being elected to European elected assemblies comes in the late 80s and early 90s, particularly in the Scandinavian countries, where they have methods of positive discrimination to ensure that a higher proportion of women were elected to Parliament or to their elected assembly. The reason why Britain began to catch up by 2005 was as a result of pressure from women who'd been active in the women's liberation movement. The women's liberation movement had been quite hostile to conventional politics, but many of them came to realize that if you want to change things, you have to be active in politics. And they put pressure particularly on the Labour Party, which before the election of 1997, which Labour won, it introduced all women's shortlists. What this meant, that a certain number of constituencies, regions that sent elected members of parliament were only allowed to choose women. So a fixed proportion of them could not choose a man. This greatly upset many men, of course. And after the election, some men did bring a legal case under the Sex Discrimination Act, and they won. It was discriminatory, and actually it was. But anyway, the outcome was that many more women were elected for the Labour Party. And so there were more women in Parliament as a whole. As you can see, 19.7% by the 2005 election. That was slightly fewer than in the 1997 election. Nothing happened in the other political parties, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, but the Conservatives particularly began increasingly to feel under pressure, and they tried in the most recent election to persuade more of their local parties to select women. Some of them also, people of ethnic minority background, Asian or Caribbean or African. Many of the local parties were very resistant, but in fact rather more women were elected for the Conservative Party also at the last election. Also important in politics was the fact that in 1999, Wales and Scotland got their own elected governments. They're not completely independent. They only have power over domestic issues like education and health, not over whether they go to war with Iraq, for example. But they had their own elections. And again, women put on a great deal of pressure when the new constitutions were being decided to ensure there was an electoral system which favoured women. It's too complicated to explain how the system works. But the outcome was that 50% of the elected assembly in Wales were female after 1999, which is the only country in the world at the time which there was elected assembly was 50% female, and is about 40% in Scotland, whereas you can see it's only less than 20% in the UK government in Westminster. England doesn't have a separate, devolved government. The government in London is responsible for the whole of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, which also has its own elected government, but hasn't done anything about women. There are very few women elected in Northern Ireland. Again, that book that circulated looks at all of these differences. And still, there were relatively few women in the influential ministerial positions, but there were more under the Labour government than under the new Conservative government elected this year. So there's been some progress in politics. An important feature of change in Britain in the last few decades has been due to immigration. Britain becoming increasingly multicultural, more complex, people from many different backgrounds. It's a gradual increase since the 1950s, but especially since the 1970s. Now about 40% of Londoners were born in another country, and 300 languages are spoken. London is a very mixed city. And on the whole, it's a change that's been quite peaceful. The largest group are Muslims from South Asia. And women in the Muslim community are often expected by their culture to lead very restricted lives, rather like those in Britain a century ago. Not allowed to travel alone or to meet men who are not members of the family, still less go out with them or marry them. Separate sex education, which does create some problems that I'll discuss later. There are also women's support groups developed within the Muslim and other communities to try to improve the rights of women. But the roles of women are very different in different ethnic groups. For example, women of Caribbean background are much more independent. Many more of them are living on their own, raising children, and far more likely to be working than Muslim women, who may work in the family firm, but not elsewhere. So there are very real and complex differences. But to come to an end, what are the main gender issues now in 2010? One is unequal pay still. On average, there's a 70% gap between the pay of men and women. There's a gap even for women without children at senior levels. The gap's greater in some occupations. It's 55% in the financial sector, according to a recent study. There are unequal opportunities for promotion and training. Childcare remains very poor, although now most mothers of children under 5 are in the workforce. That's been a real change in the last 10 to 15 years. The M shape is flattening out. Many more women are taking a very short time off from work when they have children, or almost none. Or they take their statutory leave of just a few months and then go back to work. It's partly because so many women are living on their own with children, but also the growing cost of living, cost of housing particularly, means that in many households need 2 incomes. It's become very expensive to buy or rent property. There's still inequality in the share of domestic work and childcare between mothers and fathers. The gap is narrowing, but very, very slowly. There's unequal parental leave. Maternity leave is up to 1 year, though only part of that is on full pay, and I forget which part. Paternal leave is a whole 2 weeks only, and is not at full pay. It's paid at a rather low benefit rate. Consequently, not very many men take it, but rather they take their annual holiday which is longer than 2 weeks and is at full pay, which is what many men have done for a long time. The Labour government, before it lost the election, was promising longer parental leave, or leave for paternal leave, but it lost the election. But it's pretty bad in Britain. Working hours for men and women have greatly increased over the last 2 decades, which makes work-life balance more and more difficult. It's very hard to run a family and a full-time job. There's too little support for the large numbers of single mothers. As we've seen, there are still too few elected women in politics. There are big problems still of physical and sexual violence. And there's a series of statistics there from recent statistics from reputable sources. Well, 1 in 4 women experiences domestic violence at some time in her life. According to the police, 167 women are raped every day, but only 1 in 5 reports it to the police, which is an awful lot of rapes. 2 women are murdered each week by a partner or an ex-partner. And then there are 2 particular issues which relate to the Muslim population. There are 7,250 cases of forced marriage reported each year. This is where young women, normally Muslims, are literally forced by their parents to marry someone of their choice, very often taken to Pakistan or Bangladesh on holiday and then made to marry. That's become illegal in Britain. Arranged marriages are fine if that's done with the knowledge of the husband and wife, but when it's forced upon somebody unwillingly. I mean, there are cases of girls taken out of school and just vanishing and being made to marry. And it is now, in the last 5 years or so, against the law. And 1 woman a month is murdered in a so-called honour killing, according to the police. Again, this happens in the Muslim community, where if a woman says she wants to marry a man who's not approved of, particularly with someone who is not a Muslim, then she can actually be killed by her own family. And these cases happen. And again, of course, it's against the law, and the family are very severely punished if they're caught, but it doesn't always happen within Britain. So those are very real problems that continue. The issues of domestic violence and physical and sexual violence do seem to have become worse in recent years, partly as a result of servicemen coming back from war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The same thing is happening in the United States. Men who are really quite seriously damaged by their war experience, not getting good psychiatric support, and reacting by being very violent, and they're just in a mess. And many of them ending up in prison, so it's a very difficult situation. The current financial crisis is leading to more women being unemployed than men, and particularly there are now going to be serious cuts in the public sector where women are particularly employed. There's the issue of the ageing population in Britain, as in Japan, and the majority of older people are still women, and are poorer than men, 67% of all pensioners are female. And most of the care of older people is done by women, often by family members. Some older men do it too. The birth rate has been going up since 2001, which may begin to balance things out, but not for a very long time. Women in general have lower pensions than men because the level of pension relates to the years of work and income in work. So if women work fewer years and have lower income, they get lower pension. But there's continuing pressure by women on all of these issues. Feminism hasn't gone away. And the two major campaigning organisations are, first of all, an old one, the Fawcett Society, founded in the 1920s. And there's a new one for younger women, a wholly online organisation called the F Word, which has been getting a lot of support. And I've given you their web addresses so you can see what they're interested in doing. So again, there has been change over time. It's gradual. It's happened most often when women have really fought for it, but not women on their own. I've tried to look at the main issues through the whole century. Any questions you have, I'd be happy to hear.